Winter 1944. The Ardennes Forest. A young American medic is about to make a choice that will haunt him for the rest of his life. But it won't be the choice itself that keeps him awake at night. It will be what happens after. His name was Private Daniel Fisher, 23 years old. A farm boy from Iowa who'd never seen an ocean until the army put him on a ship to Europe. He'd been trained to save lives, not take them. He wore a red-crossed armband and carried no weapon except a pair of scissors and a few vials of morphine. In the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, that made him either the bravest man in his unit or the most naive. The forest was a graveyard of frozen pines and shattered men. Snow fell thick and silent, covering the blood-soaked ground in a deceptive blanket of white. The air smelled of cordite and pine sap and something else, something metallic and wrong. Gunfire cracked through the trees in sporadic bursts. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled like an angry god. Daniel's company had been pinned down for 3 days. They were cold, exhausted, running low on ammunition and medical supplies. The Germans had launched their surprise offensive and caught the Allies completely off guard. Now, the forest belonged to no one and everyone. Every shadow could be death. Every sound could be your last warning. It was December 20th. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees. Daniel's hands were numb inside his gloves as he crouched behind a fallen oak, waiting for the shooting to stop. His medical bag lay open beside him, its contents pathetically inadequate for the carnage he'd witnessed. Bandages soaked through in minutes. Morphine ran out too fast, and the screaming never stopped. Then, in a brief lull between exchanges of fire, he heard it, a voice, weak, trembling, calling out in broken English, "Please, help me." Daniel's heart seized. The voice came from beyond their perimeter, somewhere in no man's land between the American and German positions. Every instinct told him to stay put. Medics weren't invincible. The red cross on his helmet meant nothing to a nervous rifleman or a distant sniper who couldn't see the markings through the snow and smoke. But the voice called again. "Please, I am bleeding." Daniel closed his eyes. His father's words echoed in his mind, words spoken on the porch of their farmhouse the night before he'd left for war. "You do what's right, son, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." He looked at Sergeant Morrison, a grizzled veteran from Tennessee who'd seen action in North Africa. Morrison shook his head firmly. "Don't even think about it, Doc, that's suicide." But Daniel was already moving. He grabbed his bag, raised his hands above his head to show he was unarmed, and stepped out into the open. The snow crunched beneath his boots. His breath came in visible clouds. Every step felt like walking toward his own execution. The forest held its breath. On both sides of the invisible line, men watched through their rifle sights, fingers resting on triggers, waiting to see what would happen next. Daniel could feel their eyes on him, American eyes, German eyes, all of them wondering if he was brave or just stupid. He moved slowly, deliberately, keeping his medical bag visible. His Red Cross armband stood out stark white against his olive-drab uniform. 50 yards felt like 50 miles. His legs trembled, but he forced himself to keep walking. If he stopped now, if he showed fear, someone might pull a trigger just out of reflex. The wounded soldier lay in a shallow crater, probably made by a mortar round. He was young, maybe 19 or 20. His German uniform was torn and soaked with blood. A piece of shrapnel had torn through his abdomen, and his hands were pressed uselessly against the wound, trying to hold in what wanted to escape. His face was pale, lips blue from cold and shock. His eyes found Daniel's, and something like hope flickered there. Daniel dropped to his knees beside him. "I'm a medic. I'm going to help you." The German nodded weakly. "Danke. Thank you." Up close, Daniel could see how young he really was, barely old enough to shave. There was a photograph tucked into his breast pocket, visible through the torn fabric. A woman, maybe his mother, smiling in a garden somewhere far from this frozen hell. Daniel's training took over. He worked quickly, cutting away the bloody uniform, assessing the damage. It was bad. The shrapnel had penetrated deep. Without surgery, without proper facilities, the boy had maybe an hour, maybe less. But Daniel could ease his pain. He could give him that much. He pulled out a vial of morphine, one of his last 3, and prepared the injection. The German soldier watched him with those frightened young eyes. "My name is Klaus," he whispered. "Klaus Zimmermann, Daniel Fischer." He administered the morphine, watched it begin to take effect. "You're going to be okay, Klaus." It was a lie, but it was a kind one. Klaus's breathing eased slightly as the drug dulled his agony. He looked up at the grey sky, snowflakes landing on his face. "I did not want this war," he said softly. "None of us did. But they told us we were defending our homeland. They showed us maps, told us the Americans would not stop until Germany was destroyed. We believed them because we had to believe something." Daniel said nothing. He just kept working, packing the wound with gauze that turned red immediately, trying to slow the bleeding. Around them, the forest remained eerily quiet. Both sides were watching this strange tableau unfold. "Do you know what they made us do?" Klaus continued, his voice distant now, floating on the morphine. "In Poland, in Russia, the things we saw, the things some of us had to do." His eyes filled with tears that froze on his cheeks. "I was a teacher before the war. Mathematics. I taught children. I never hurt anyone." Daniel's hands paused. "Then why are you here?" "Because they came to my school one day and said I was going to the Eastern Front. If I refused, my family would be arrested. My mother, my sister. So I went. And I saw things that no one should see." Klaus's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Daniel had to lean close to hear him over the wind moving through the frozen pines. The morphine was carrying Klaus away from his pain, but also towards something else, some need to confess. "There was a village," Klaus said, "in Poland. The SS came through before us. We were regular Wehrmacht, you understand. Not S, not the fanatics, just soldiers. But we came after them, and we saw what they did." His breath came in short gasps now. "They lined up families, children, old people, shot them all, left them in a ditch." Daniel's stomach turned. He'd heard rumors, reports that seemed too horrible to believe. But hearing it from the mouth of someone who'd been there, seeing the anguish in Klaus's dying eyes, made it real in a way that reports never could. "Our commander, he gathered us together," Klaus continued. "He said we would never speak of what we saw, that it was necessary for the Reich. But I saw him crying later, behind the supply truck. A grown man, a decorated officer, weeping like a child." Klaus coughed, blood flecking his lips. "We are not all monsters, Daniel. But we served the monsters. Does that make us monsters too?" Daniel didn't know how to answer. He was just a farm boy from Iowa, trained to bandage wounds and set bones. No one had trained him for this, for the moral weight of holding an enemy soldier while he died and unburdened his soul. "I need you to know something," Klaus said, gripping Daniel's arm with surprising strength. "Something important. You must listen." "I'm listening." 3 days ago, before the offensive began, I was in a command tent. I was assigned to carry dispatches. I overheard officers talking. They said American forces were being repositioned. They mentioned Bastogne. They said it would be critical to the offensive, that if they could take Bastogne, they could split the Allied lines. Daniel's pulse quickened. "What else did you hear?" "They are sending a major force toward the town. Thousands of men, tanks. They want to encircle it before American reinforcements arrive, but they are worried about supply lines, the fuel depots." Klaus coughed again, harder this time. "The fuel depots are being set up in the forest near Neville. If the Americans could strike them, it would cripple the advance." This was intelligence. Real, actionable intelligence that could save American lives. Daniel looked back toward his own lines, invisible in the snowy forest. He should call for help, get Klaus back for interrogation. But he knew, looking at the boy's grey face and the blood that wouldn't stop flowing, that Klaus wouldn't make it 50 yards. "Why are you telling me this?" Danny asked. Klaus met his eyes. "Because I am dying, and I no longer care about their war. Because you came out here to help me when you could have stayed safe. Because maybe, if this information helps end this battle faster, fewer men will die in this frozen hell." He smiled sadly. "And because I want to believe that my death might mean something, that I might save some lives to balance the ones I couldn't save." The morphine was pulling him under now. His grip on Daniel's arm weakened. "Tell my mother. Tell her I tried to be good. Tell her I'm sorry." "I will." Daniel promised, another kind lie. The Battle of the Bulge raged on for weeks, but the tide had turned. Without adequate fuel, the German forces couldn't sustain their push. Bastogne held. The Allies counterattacked. And slowly, painfully, the Wehrmacht was pushed back. Daniel Fischer continued his work as a medic through the rest of the winter, through the spring, all the way to the war's end. He saved dozens of men, maybe more, but he never forgot the young German soldier who died in his arms and given him the information that saved countless others. After the war, Daniel went home to Iowa. He married a girl from his hometown, became a doctor, spent 40 years treating sick children and delivering babies. He rarely spoke about the war. When his own children asked, he would give them the simple version, the sanitized stories that didn't include the blood and the screaming and the terrible choices. But in 1987, on a trip to Germany, Daniel did something he'd been planning for years. He tracked down Klaus Zimmermann's family. It took weeks of searching, of following old records and asking questions in small towns. But eventually, he found Klaus's sister, now an elderly woman living in a quiet village near Frankfurt. Her name was Greta. She invited Daniel into her home, served him coffee, and listened as he told her about her brother's final moments. He kept his promise. He told her that Klaus had tried to be good, that he'd been sorry. He didn't tell her about the intelligence, about how Klaus's dying confession had changed the course of a battle. That seemed too impersonal, too tactical for what had been such a deeply human moment. But he told her that Klaus had been brave, that he'd spoken of teaching children mathematics, that he'd talked about her and their mother with love in his voice, that his last thoughts had been of home. Greta wept. She showed Daniel photographs. Klaus as a boy, grinning gap-toothed at the camera. Klaus in his teacher's clothes, serious and proud on his first day at the school. Klaus in uniform, looking scared and far too young, right before he was sent east. "We never knew what happened to him," Greta said. "Just that he died in the Ardennes. They sent us a letter. It was very brief, very official. It said nothing about who he was, or how he died, or if anyone was with him." She took Daniel's hand. "Thank you for being there. Thank you for not leaving him alone." Daniel returned to Iowa carrying something lighter than what he'd brought to Germany. Some wounds, he learned, could heal, even decades later. Some promises, when finally kept, could close circles that had been open for too long. He lived to be 87 years old. In his final days, in a hospital room with his family gathered around, he drifted in and out of consciousness. At one point, his daughter heard him murmur something about snow and a young man named Klaus and the cold forest, where two enemies had met and found their shared humanity. Daniel Fisher died peacefully in his sleep. And perhaps, in whatever comes after, he met Klaus Zimmermann again. Perhaps they walked together through a forest where no guns fired, where the snow fell soft and clean, where former enemies could finally just be two men who'd done their best in an impossible war. The moral of the story isn't about heroism or sacrifice, or even about the intelligence that changed a battle. It's simpler and more profound than that. It's about the moment when we choose to see the human being in front of us instead of the uniform they wear. About the connections that transcend flags and borders and all the artificial lines we draw between us and them. In the end, Daniel Fisher saved Klaus Zimmermann's soul by listening to his confession, and Klaus saved countless lives by trusting an enemy medic with the truth. Two young men, caught in a war neither of them wanted, found a way to matter to each other in the midst of madness. That frozen crater in the Ardennes forest is still there, probably. The trees have grown back. The blood has long since washed away. But for 40 years, it lived in the memory of an Iowa doctor who never forgot the German boy who called out for help, who trusted him, who gave him the gift of truth in his dying moments. Some stories deserve to be remembered, not because they're about grand strategies or famous generals or turning points that changed history, but because they're about the small, fierce light of compassion that refuses to go out even in the darkest places. This is one of those stories,